Have we got everyone here? Great. My name is Jane Siolan, your MC for today. I am an Irukandji woman of a Jabbergai language-speaking nation of far north Queensland and with cultural connections to Wulgurukaba Nation. As Director First Peoples at ACU, I acknowledge that our campus, located here in Brisbane, is situated on Yagara and Turrbal country. A very warm welcome to each of you, and especially to today's speakers and special guests, the Honourable Josh Frydenberg, MP, Member for Kooyong, Treasurer of the Commonwealth of Australia, Senator Andrew Bragg, Senator for New South Wales and Visiting Fellow of ACU's PM Glenn Institute, and Mr Ian Ham, Yorta Yorta Man, and Chair of the First Nations Foundation. I'm delighted to be part of today's launch of Buraadja. You will know that 17th of August 2021 marks the 50th anniversary of the swearing in of Neville Bonner as a Senator for Queensland. Senator Bonner was recognised as the first Aboriginal person to serve in an Australian legislature. And to commemorate this milestone in our nation's history and to celebrate this legacy, ACU, Australian Catholic University, has partnered with Uphold and Recognise to commission a video. The video has been produced with the very generous support of Mr Greg O'Neill, CEO of La Trobe Financial. I now invite Mr Ian Hammond to provide our formal welcome to country prior to launch of the very special video. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Jane, and it's a pleasure to be here. As Jane said, my name is Ian Ham and I'm a Yorta Yorta man. My country is in northern Victoria and southern New South Wales. It's a pleasure to be asked to do this today, for a number of reasons. One of those is that Shepparton, where Andrew is from, is in Yorta Yorta country. So we come from the same part of Australia. We share a common bond. I often get asked about country, about a welcome, what's its importance? How do I describe how it matters to us as a people? The best description I have is that the waters of the Murray River and the Goulburn River is the blood in my veins. The trees and the roots in the earth are the bones of my body. The dirt, the clay, the soils are the muscles that hold me together. The breeze through the trees and the flapping of the leaves is the breath in my lungs. And the life in me is all the animal life, all the bird life, all the tree life. So when we say welcome to our country, it's welcoming you not only to just being on our place, but being part of who we are, being involved in us in a way that is extraordinarily hard to describe, but I hope I've done that a little bit today. The other reason I'm very pleased to be here today is not only to welcome you to country, but also to acknowledge the importance of the book that's being launched today. As Jane said, it's 50 years since Neville Bonner was sworn into the Parliament. And I think about how far we have come in that time. Since 1967, since Neville Bonner was sworn in, where we are today, Eddie Mabo winning his case, land rights, civil rights. But I also look at where we are going as well. I think about the great opportunities for us to progress as a nation. And right now, we speak of the Uluru Statement, voices to Parliament and constitutional recognition. The more voices we have in this debate, the more important it is. And it's important those voices come from everywhere, and particularly all sides of politics, which is why Andrew's book is critically important at this time, to be part of the discussion, to be part of the contest of ideas. As an Aboriginal man, I'm apolitical. My single focus is on the uplift and the benefit and a thriving future for my people, and this book contributes to part of that discussion. So I'm really pleased to be here to help with the launching of this book. I would like now to welcome you all onto the country where you are today, or acknowledge you on the country that you are today. Welcome those of you who are on Yorta Yorta land, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and importantly in this case, future, about where we are going. I trust you will respect the land on which you stand. I trust you will respect the laws and customs of our people, and I trust that you'll be part of the discussions about how all Australians have an opportunity to participate in helping Aboriginal people thrive and be an important part of where we go as a nation. Thank you.
In 1971, 50 years ago, Neville Bonner became the first Indigenous Australian to enter the Parliament of Australia, representing the people of Queensland for the Liberal Party.
I remember Neville Bonner as a warm, likeable, proud Australian of Aboriginal descent, who was also very proud that he was a Liberal.
Here was a man who was born on a desolate island in northern New South Wales and who rose to enter the National Parliament. He got there really the hard way. He didn't have much education. He had a difficult job, and yet he succeeded in the world. He was a wonderful man.
It was a period of rapid change in Australia in advancing the rights of Indigenous peoples. In 1967, Liberal Prime Minister Harold Holt led a referendum where more than 90% of Australians voted yes to give the Commonwealth the power to make laws for Aboriginal peoples and to count Aboriginal people in the census.
Menzies lauded personal effort and recognition of personal effort, and this really resonated with Neville Bonner. Fraser realised the great disadvantages that Aboriginal people had then, unfortunately still have now, and Fraser determined to do something about it.
Neville Bonner admired Malcolm Fraser's leadership, remarking, "We'd never have got the land rights in the Northern Territory if it hadn't been for Malcolm Fraser." He had an affinity, he had a deep concern and a deep commitment to the Aboriginal people of this country. In 1979, Bonner was the first backbencher to introduce a government bill and have that bill passed when the Liberal Party created the Aboriginal Development Commission.
What a moment. Here was an Aboriginal person introducing a bill about the Aboriginal Development Commission. It meant an awful lot to Neville.
I will not condone breaking the law.
He was very conscious that he was the first Aboriginal Australian to have been elected to the National Parliament. He wasn't a one-issue person. He wasn't somebody who only focused on that.
Discrimination and challenges followed him his whole life.
Those incidences in which people wouldn't courtesy or acknowledge his position as they would others, it stung him, but it strengthened his resolve to continue to conduct himself in a way that he knew they weren't, but was reflective of the integrity of his race.
He taught me a lot about being a senator and a lot about being a human being, so very grateful to him.
His resolute dedication to achieve his goal to enter politics and represent our people remains an inspiration for me.
Each parliament, each government has an opportunity to shape the future in ways we can barely imagine at the time.
The Liberals of today should be reminded that they had in their own party, in their own party room, one of the historical figures of Aboriginal Australia.
Powerful message. Thank you, Ian, for your welcome. A very warm and a heartfelt welcome, I might add too. Our connection with Neville Bonner is that Mrs. Madonna Thompson, who kindly gave her support for the video and contributed to the video on behalf of the Bonner family, is a good friend of ACU and of our campus here in Brisbane. So we have a very special relationship, I think, with Madonna and the Bonner family. Can I add that on a personal note? My father was involved in the early days of the One People Australia League, so we were very honoured and privileged to have had a connection with Uncle Neville Bonner himself and his family. It is now my pleasure to introduce Senator Andrew Bragg, Senator for New South Wales, and visiting fellow of ACU's PM Glen Institute, to offer his remarks. Thank you, Andrew.
Well, good morning, Jane, and thank you very much for your presentation this morning, and good morning to you as well, Ian and Treasurer. I'd like to start by acknowledging country, and I wanted to especially thank you, Ian Ham, for being available today. Ian and I both grew up on the Yorta country in Northern Victoria, and that is something that we have in common, and is something that I think is something that I carry around and think about often, even though I represent a different state in our country. I also wanted to acknowledge Mr. Greg O'Neill, who is the person that enabled the video you just saw of Neville Bonner. And I wanted to acknowledge all the effort that's gone into that at ACU, of bringing together, I think, that quite powerful and moving 3-minute video about the former senator, who was a real trailblazer. I also wanted to acknowledge this morning that we have Peter Boehm online, who was in that video and was the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs during the Fraser government. And I think Peter is a great Australian, and it's great to have you this morning. So, Treasurer, thank you for making your time available. I will briefly introduce you, but before I do that, I will speak about the book. I mean, the whole point of writing the book was to make a case for more innovation and more leadership in relation to Indigenous affairs. And the book is broken down into 3 parts. And in the Darugha language of the Yuin people of the South Coast, it is yesterday, today, and tomorrow, which is Bugawa, Nawe, and Buraadja. And the contention here, or the key point is, if we want to have a more ambitious tomorrow, Buraadja, we need to have a better understanding of our yesterday, or Bugawa. And as you saw from that video, and for people who have looked at the book, there is a real record of achievement in terms of what Harold Holt did and what Malcolm Fraser did in particular. And that is not to say that everything has been hunky-dory. It hasn't been. But there have been real moments in the past where Liberal leaders have grasped the nettle and have been prepared to take risks to advance a somewhat difficult agenda. And if you go back and you talk to people like Peter Boehm and Ian Viner and Fred Chaney, who were the ministers in the Fraser government, they will tell you that the land rights laws that were passed in 1976 were not easy laws to pass, because the miners were against them, the pastoralists were against them, the territory government didn't want them, but yet they were forced through. I also wanted to reflect briefly about the Victorians, and noting that my good friend, the Treasurer, is the senior Victorian today and the deputy leader of our party. The Victorians have more than carried their weight over the course of time. Fraser, Holt have landmark achievements in Indigenous affairs. But it's also, I think, a great reflection of the Menzies government, that the Menzies government established AATSIS, the body charged to preserve and conserve Indigenous language and culture. And actually, another Victorian, Marshall Langton, made this point to me, that it was a natural instinct for a Conservative government, the Menzies government, to conserve. Now, there's no question that there were flawed policies in that period, just as there are today. But I think you can see the benefit of the Menzies government having established AATSIS, even just in this book. This book, Buraadja, has its name from the Darugha language. The Darugha language was brought back to life and put into a dictionary by the Yuin elders in conjunction with AATSIS. And now in towns like Buraadja on the south coast of New South Wales, in my state, they are teaching the Darugha language to the kids at the schools, which I think is a remarkable closing of the circle over these last 60 years. Now, the Treasurer, of course, is the modern Menzies. He is the person that represents that seat today in the Parliament. So I think it is a nice touch. On the voice, which is the main issue of the day, I guess, I mean, the simple argument for the voice is that if you're going to have special laws for people, as we do for Indigenous people, 18 different laws, you have to give people a say over how those laws are made and how those policies are deployed. I think there is a very, very strong liberal and conservative case for having a voice. And the good news is that under our government, the meat is now on the bones in terms of the report that Marsha Langton and Tom Culmer have been developing. And I think now it is the appropriate time that we do start to look at the legal and constitutional issues which have not been canvassed in the Langton-Culmer process, but are necessary for us to close this particular circle. The reason we're talking about constitutional recognition is largely because John Howard put it on the agenda in 2007. Now, we've been talking about it for 15 years, which is too long. So the issue with the voice is that it cannot end with legislation. It needs to end with a constitutional amendment because a constitutional discussion needs to be concluded with a constitutional amendment. It cannot be concluded with legislation. Finally, I did also want to reflect on minorities. And the Indigenous people of Australia are a minority at 3% of the population. And that is very important when you think about how a constitutional amendment could be delivered. A constitutional amendment, by definition, as Rachel Perkins always reminds me, requires a majority of people and a majority of states. So it's a double majority. So we actually need the broad Australian populace to engage in these issues. And as a non-Indigenous person, not wanting to speak for anyone else other than myself, I thought it was important to put the case out about why this was necessary, but also to try and start a broader set of conversations with people who are not Indigenous, who may not know any Indigenous people, but want the country to be reconciled and want us to conclude the unfinished business. And I think there is a real resonance, I noticed, between minorities here. And I don't think the Treasurer would mind me highlighting that there are a lot of Jewish Australians that have given their time, people like Mark Liebler and Damien Freeman, who've been very generous with their time and their effort in advancing this case. And I imagine that Jewish Australians understand this perhaps better than others, given the history here. And I think there is a parallel here also with the recent vote we had in 2007 on same-sex marriage, that it would be the proposition that a majority would be asked to give something to a minority without taking anything from anyone else. And so I think there are some real parallels there. But I'm really the warm-up act today. I am here to introduce my great friend, the Treasurer and the Deputy Leader of my party. And I would say about the Treasurer that he is a very thoughtful man. He reads widely. He thinks deeply about issues. And for people who know him well, they would know that he is a great connector and a very warm person. And what you see is what you really get. And that's why I feel so privileged to be his parliamentary colleague, because he is warm, he is a great connector, and he is what you see. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce today the Deputy Leader of my party and my great friend and colleague, Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And there are many friends on this call today. And like you, I'd like to specifically acknowledge Peter Bowman. Thank you for that reflection too on the contribution of Jewish Australians to progressing the Indigenous cause. There's one other name I'd mention there, which was the late, great Ron Caston, who was a mentor to Noel Pearson and was very heavily involved in the Mabo case. And I had the great privilege to know him. But you're right, people like Mark Liebler and Ron Caston and many others have left their mark. It is a great pleasure to join you all today. And let me start my remarks by going back to Neville Bonner. As we discussed earlier in that video, 50 years ago, he became the first Indigenous Australian to serve in our parliament. And he said in his first speech For too long, we've been crying out, but too few have heard us. And he subsequently went on to say, for all the noble words and the noble sentiments that have been expressed about progressing the Indigenous cause, they've been blown away by the winds of indifference. This is the great tragedy. Our first Australians, our Indigenous people, have not received the recognition that they deserve, and they have not enjoyed the outcomes that they deserved. I think in this book, Buraadja, by my good friend, Senator Bragg, is a real effort to change that trajectory, to change that experience. Andrew's book is honest, it's forthright, he's passionate about the cause, he provides an intellectual and a historical framework to think about this important issue of reconciliation. And Andrew takes us on a journey from the past to the present and into the future. And importantly, Andrew puts the achievements also in a very liberal context. And Andrew points out in this book that liberalism and Indigenous affairs are not in a permanent state of conflict, far from it, far from it. And obviously you reference our party's founder, Sir Robert Menzies, and he specifically talked about the Liberal Party as being a progressive party. That's why he took the name Liberal, because we weren't a reactionary party. And Andrew references the fact that Menzies often talked about not being doctrinaire in our approach. And as you said, Andrew, I feel very privileged to be the 7th person since Federation to hold his seat. And indeed, Kooyong is an Indigenous word meaning resting place. And obviously Harold Holt is delved into quite significant detail in terms of his achievement in 1967, with Aboriginal people being counted in the census and the Parliament being able to make laws for Aboriginal people. It's a very significant change. And when we talk about Neville Bonner, again, it's referenced in the book that Neville was handing out how to vote cards for the Liberal Party at that election, and Bill Hayden approached him and said, Neville, you should be joining the Labor Party. And at that point, Neville said, well, I'm going to go and join the Liberals, and he began his pathway to Canberra. But Andrew also puts what happened in 1967 in a bit of context as well, when he referenced the fact that Tom Frame, as the biographer on Holt, only assigns 4 pages effectively to the story of the 67 referendum. And given the significance of that achievement, Andrew explains that this is maybe one of an example of how we don't discuss in sufficient detail the significance of those Liberal achievements. And Fraser and what happened with land rights and his achievements there are explained. And there's a nice vignette from Fred Chaney saying to Malcolm Fraser, there's no votes in this, Malcolm, but it's the right thing to do. And they both agreed. Then also you hear about Tony Abbott and what his speech at the Gama Festival, where he talked about Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, not being merely about constitutional change, but about completing the Constitution. Obviously, Andrew's good friend and mine, Ken Wyatt, as being Australia's first Indigenous person to sit in the cabinet and to be the first Indigenous person to be the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. And then Andrew talks at length too about John Howard. And to Andrew's credit, he points out that when people turned their back on Howard early on in his prime ministership, that was wrong because it was disrespectful to the office. And Andrew talks about how Howard struggled through the issues of the Wick judgment and the ramifications that it had. But back in 2007, when on the eve of that election, Howard gave that speech on Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, Noel Pearson points out it was the first time an Australian Prime Minister mentioned the word recognition. And that was John Howard in 2007. So there is a long history of Liberal achievements in Indigenous affairs. And I think Andrew puts that very important historical context, because in order to know where you're going, you have to know where you come from. And Andrew does that very well. I mean, quite clearly, we've done a lot as a country in trying to close the gap. Much money has been spent, many programs have been started. And Andrew goes into detail about the importance of collecting data and the strength of Indigenous institutions. But as Prime Minister Scott Morrison said in the Parliament just a few weeks ago with respect to closing the gap, we may be doing well on preschools, but incarceration rates, youth detention, life expectancy, we're nowhere near where we want to be. But Andrew points out that what we are doing on closing the gap needs to be seen as just part of the story, not the whole story. And this brings me to what his central thesis is in the book, which is that contested space of the Uluru Statement, the Voice, more broadly reconciliation, where he makes a very powerful case for constitutional change. Now, I'm not going to go as far today as Gladys did or Stephen Marshall did in endorsing this book, and indeed in terms of endorsing Andrew's central thesis about constitutional change. What I would do, though, is talk about the purpose, the goal of what they're seeking to do with this constitutional change. Because we know how difficult it is to get constitutional change through in our parliament and our country, where we need that double majority of voters and states. But also legislative change is difficult too. And I don't think we should overlook that fact as well. But as Andrew pointed out, he's not seeking legislative change, he's seeking something bigger than that. But my point is, we've really got to focus on what unites us here and not what divides us. And what we need to do is ensure that the change, whatever form it takes, is bipartisan. You don't get many chances at this, and you need to take the public with you. And that's why it needs to be subject to negotiation, consultation. There needs to be flexibility. Because if this proposition in the Voice is a take it or leave it, I don't think it necessarily advances in the way that some people would like it to do. And this is the reality that we have to shape. And this is where we have to work through the issue. And this is what Andrew has done here. The book really does challenge us. And Andrew himself takes us on his own personal journey, where you reference, Andrew, when you were a young boy in Shepparton and you thought that you maybe have engaged in a bit of casual racism when you were jealous of some young Indigenous kids getting a government grant for a particular purchase. I think it was of a hovercraft. And then your own experience as a student at the ANU going down to see the tent embassy and not feeling comfortable about it, only to be challenged by one of your friends. You take us on a journey. And I think that's what this book does. I think this book takes people on a journey. It challenges people. Many people will not find themselves agreeing with every word that Andrew has said or his prognosis or indeed his prescription. But what he does do is he gets us to think about the importance of change and recognition. Andrew and I have a good friend in Julian Leeser in the Parliament who's also been very active in this space. And Julian makes the point, it's not about necessarily the words in the Constitution. It's actually about enabling the people to be, to have their views felt about the laws that affect them. And he talks about local, regional, and national implications. So, Andrew, I think you've done us all a great service by putting this book together. It's an enormous amount of work. I think this book prods, it persuades, it's practical, but we also know when we're talking about this realm of change and this area of change, you've got to also think about how to take people with us. And I want to finish with something that Noel Pearson said back in 2004. He actually said back then, and Mark Liebler reminded us of this not that long ago in an article, I think back in June, where he said, Pearson said, only a conservative leader that can carry the conservative sections of our society will be actually able to deliver this true solution, this true reconciliation, this true change. And I think that's what you've tried to tap here, Andrew. I think the reason why you've written this book is because you want your own side of politics to be championing this change. And you want to couch it in terms of the great liberal tradition of being progressive from Menzies to Morrison. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to launch Buraadja. I learned a lot reading through it. I thought it was a fantastic intellectual and historical expose, and I am very hopeful for the future. I want people to understand that there are many people across the Parliament who are determined to see change. What exact form that takes, time will tell, but there is certainly a willingness to enter into this debate to ensure that our Indigenous Australians, our first Australians, get the recognition and the outcomes that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wow, some insightful, heartfelt, and I think authentic comments, Treasurer. I think we have all been moved by those comments as well. It's time now to offer our thanks for participating in today's session. Honourable Josh Frydenberg, I think that you have really highlighted the importance of listening and hearing voices, especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And Senator Bragg, your book obviously is an important piece of work for all Australians. As Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, we remember that we walk in the footsteps of our elders and our ancestors who have gone before us. Today, we've been able to honour our elder in Neville Bonner, but also appreciate the voices that you've brought to light through your book, Buraadja. I thank you for your contribution for honouring Senator Neville Bonner. You've shaped our nation's story and recognised the milestone of his 50th anniversary. Congratulations on your book, and you can add esteemed author to your resume, and I'll be getting a copy of that book. Thank you to the behind the scenes work, especially Damien Freeman and Charlotte Mortlock of the Office of Senator Andrew Bragg. Thank you everybody for your presence today. Please remember that the book is available for ordering online. And I take this opportunity to wish you all an enjoyable day. Thank you.